Disney's Frozen is nothing short of a phenomenon. Upon its release in 2013, the film quickly captured the hearts of children and adults alike, garnering massive commercial success as well as critical acclaim. So when a Broadway adaptation was announced in early 2014, it didn't come as a surprise to many. Director Michael Grandage was at the helm, and by his side were members of the film's creative team. With Kristen Anderson Lopez and Robert Lopez creating the music, and Jennifer Lee writing the book, the production seemed poised for success. And after 5 years in development, Frozen the musical officially opened on Broadway in March of 2019. However, just a little over a year later, amidst the Broadway shutdown caused by the coronavirus pandemic, producers of the musical announced that Frozen will not be returning to the stage once theatres open again. The main reason stated was the lack of belief that audiences will return in substantial enough numbers to sustain all 3 of Disney's current Broadway shows. So in this essay, I want to discuss Frozen's short-lived run on Broadway and look at the ways in which the stage translation of the Academy Award, Golden Globe, and BAFTA-winning film may have fallen short. Though remaining true enough to the source material to satisfy pre-existing fans, many critics agreed that the musical was a safe and almost formulaic translation of a Disney film to stage. While the performances of the cast were often commended, many took issue with the plot, which had lost much of its conflict in translation. At the heart of it, Frozen is a tale of 2 sisters and the rebuilding of their strained relationship through finally figuring out how to trust each other. The theatrics of the growing blizzard, the love interest turned secret villain, and the freezing heart simply worked to build tension and add stakes to this otherwise rather intimate story about learning to be vulnerable with the people you love. And while animation was more than capable of taking the characters' inner conflicts and visualizing them in stunning ways, such as the building of a bridge of ice under Elsa's feet as she runs away from a kingdom, the adaptation to stage presented a set of limitations unique to its form. There are things that can be done in animation that simply are not possible on stage. You can only demonstrate Elsa's powers in so many feasible, practical ways, and after the huge display of special effects in Let It Go, the demonstrations of magic in the rest of the musical may end up being a little underwhelming or repetitive. As Jesse Green writes in his review for the New York Times, if there are dozens of words for snow in circumpolar languages, there are as many looks for ice in Frozen. I'm sorry to say that none of these special effects are especially effective, except in reminding you that there are things that cannot be done well on stage. Another shortcoming was that while animation was able to artfully bridge the darker elements of the story with the more comedic ones, the same could not be said about the stage adaptation. According to David Rooney, who writes for The Hollywood Reporter, the comedic elements of the musical felt rather strained. Anna's open-hearted determination is just never as compelling as the brooding Elsa's torment, and this led to an unequal dynamic between the 2 leads. Ultimately, the critics' consensus seemed to be that while Frozen the musical had potential, it lacked the inventiveness that sets other Disney stage musicals such as The Lion King apart. Instead of reimagining the story, the musical exists more as an underwhelming live-action rehashing of the film. Now, I live halfway across the world and don't have the privilege of seeing the musical live, so my opinions on the staging are limited to the promotional materials they've released and live TV performances they've done. Because of this, I won't focus too much on any issues regarding staging and production design. What I do have access to, though, is the cast recording, and while I don't believe you can fully judge the merit of an entire musical on that alone, I'd say it's a pretty accurate representation of how the creative team has chosen to tackle the characters' emotional journeys and growth. And like I said, the core of Frozen is very much about the emotional journeys of 2 sisters learning to be vulnerable with each other. And as with most film to musical adaptations, the progression of events stick pretty closely to the movie, so the main bulk of what I'm missing is the visual production elements, which again I'm not in a position to comment on, so I won't. Instead, for the rest of this essay, I'll largely be focusing on the popularity of pre-existing songs and how it has impacted the musical. When I was listening to the album for the first time, what quickly became kind of apparent, at least to me, was the distinction between songs from the movie and songs written for the stage. Of the 12 new songs added to the initial 8, I'd say there's a good mix of songs that solely serve the purpose of narrative and/or character development, and songs that were standouts. But I'd also say none of them quite have the same earworm-like quality which propelled the songs of the film to massive commercial success. Though the music is written by the same duo that wrote the music for the film, they now have the added pressure of doing justice to their already beloved numbers. And because of the incredible success and instantly recognizable nature of these pre-existing songs, it creates a standard that is almost impossibly high for the new songs to live up to. I mean, sure, to give Hans a song after Anna leaves him in charge of Arendelle seems like an effective way to showcase his leadership and portray him as endearing and harmless. Don't get me wrong, I think the song is great, but to park it in between heavyweights like In Summer and Let It Go renders the impact and the chances of audiences remembering the song almost obsolete. You might be thinking, the same could be said for most of Disney's movie-to-stage adaptations. The Little Mermaid has the iconic Part of Your World, Aladdin has Friend Like Me, and Beauty and the Beast had Tale as Old as Time. And in each of these stage adaptations, new songs were added to supplement the existing ones as well. So what makes Frozen unique? With an Academy Award and Grammy for Best Song, 3.5 million digital copies sold in the US alone, close to 300 million plays on Spotify by June 2019, and translations in dozens of different languages, the unparalleled success of Let It Go has arguably solidified it as Disney's most iconic song of possibly all time. However, the unprecedented success of this one song may have had significant impacts on Frozen's stage adaptation. Namely, it may have inadvertently trapped the musical's creative team into using it as the Act 1 finale. No doubt, this is the titular song of the film, and initially this does seem like the obvious choice. It's an emotional climax after all. We could even liken it to Defying Gravity from Wicked. In both musicals, the Act 1 closer features protagonists that have largely been, up till that point, controlled by their fear, shame, and self-hatred, which is caused by their inability to conform to their society's norms of appearance and/or ability. And over the course of the song, they finally begin to reject the expectations people have of them and embrace themselves. However, upon closer examination, we start to see how their narrative significance differs. Now, I'm not contesting the significance people might personally find in Let It Go. Outside the context of the story, it's a song that advocates for empowerment and freedom by rejecting the established norms of society. But solely from a narrative standpoint, Let It Go doesn't mark the end of a journey for Elsa and the beginning of a new one. Instead, it's an extension of struggles she has faced before. Yes, she finally lets go of her inhibitions and allows herself to use her powers freely. But she still chooses to do so in isolation out of fear that she'll be a danger to the people around her. Lyrics such as Let the Storm Rage On and The Cold Never Bothered Me Anyway indicate a certain passivity in the character. She is avoiding confronting her situation, instead opting to let it unfold around her, convincing herself that she can live with her inner turmoil. The castle she has built for herself is hardly different from the room she has locked herself in, except now it's flashy and made of ice, with added security. Sparked by a momentary loss of control and a split-second decision to run, what ensues in Let It Go feels like a product of circumstance, where the most significant development, narratively, is the escalation of Elsa's escapism. This marks a lack of significant growth, at least not enough for an Act 1 closer for a musical. On the other hand, let's take a look at Defying Gravity from Wicked. Prior to watching the musical, audience members would have already been acquainted with Elphaba as the Wicked Witch of the West. However, when she is first introduced on stage, she couldn't be further from the vengeful villain we have come to expect. Instead, she is optimistic, witty, hopeful, and more than capable of forming meaningful relationships with the characters around her. It is only during Defying Gravity that we see someone vaguely comparable to the Wicked Witch we grew up with. At this point, she realizes the thing she has pinned all her hopes on, the wizard, is nothing but a hoax and a con man. All the self-hatred, shame, and unfair treatment she has endured manifests itself in a need to seek justice and the conviction to work against the very man she has looked up to thus far. She chooses to take action. This is a significant turning point. It completely changes the course of the story. Elphaba's uncertainty solidifies into courage within the duration of Defying Gravity, whereas in Let It Go, the lyrics of the song tell a story of empowerment and rejection of expectations, but Elsa's actions of continued self-inflicted isolation tells the opposite. And by deeming it an emotional peak for the musical, or even just the character, might be an act of overstating its significance. Now, why am I spending so much time on Let It Go? After all, it's just one song out of many. The thing is, by placing it in the middle of the musical, it throws off the narrative structure. But to further examine this, we'll first have to dissect the structures typically employed in film and musical. One of the most commonly employed structures in film is the three-act structure, comprising the setup, confrontation, and resolution. Let's compare this to the Frozen film. In the setup, the film establishes the setting, the time period, characters, themes, and tells us what we can expect for the rest of the movie. We are told that we are in the fictional land of Arendelle. The costumes and the modes of transportation set the story firmly in the past, and we are introduced to Elsa, Anna, Hans, Kristoff, Sven, and Olaf, the core characters of the film. Since the movie begins with Elsa injuring Anna with her powers, which leads to their separation and eventual tense reunion, we know the story is centered around the relationship of these two sisters, and the core conflict is set up when Elsa runs away after revealing her powers to the guest at the coronation due to her inability to control them. She sets off an eternal winter in her wake. Anna follows her, leaving Hans in charge, and encounters other quirky characters in her journey. All of these plot points set up how the story will progress, and we end Act 1 with Let It Go, getting the audience excited for what comes next. Act 2, the confrontation, is the bulk of the film. The story starts to expand, characters achieve small goals and develop new ones, but encounter bigger obstacles, and a deadline is imposed on the characters to achieve said goals. We go from a ballroom with most of our core characters to 3 separate concurrent storylines. Elsa is trying her best to stay away from everyone, Anna, Kristoff, Sven, and Olaf are looking for Elsa, and Hans is in charge of the kingdom and looking for Anna. Anna eventually finds Elsa but is struck in the heart by her powers, and now has the bigger goal of finding a remedy for her freezing heart in time. Elsa finds out that she has set off an eternal winter and realizes she has the responsibility of stopping it. Hans finds Elsa and captures her. Act 3 begins with characters reaching their lowest point and builds towards the climax where the storylines converge and ends with the resolution of the core conflict. Elsa is imprisoned, Hans is revealed to be the no-good scheming villain and leaves Anna to die, while Kristoff realizes he loves Anna. The storylines converge when Elsa escapes with Hans in pursuit. He convinces her that Anna is dead because of her. She collapses in despair and Hans approaches her with a sword. Anna realizes that Kristoff is her true love, sets off to find him, but realizes what is happening just as she's about to reach him and forgoes possibly her last shot at saving herself by rushing to shield Elsa from Hans' sword instead. And by sacrificing her life for her sister, she commits an act of true love and begins to thaw. Elsa realizes love is the key to controlling her powers and unfreezes Arendelle. Traitor Hans is sent back to his own country, Anna and Kristoff get together, the sisters reconcile, and it's a happily ever after. Till Frozen 2 at least. So this was just a general outline of the plot, but you get the idea. Now let's look at the 2-act structure of many modern plays and most musicals. Act 1 usually begins with some exposition, context that the audience needs to know before being dropped in the middle of a developing story. The inciting incident then occurs, an act that triggers the events of the story. A couple of scenes follow to build tension, leading up to an emotional high point which causes the story to dramatically change course. In some cases, Act 1 closes with the protagonist seeming to have achieved the initial goal, which is related to the inciting incident. Act 2 begins with more exposition, catching the audience up on all that has happened during intermission as the core conflict set up in Act 1 begins to develop again. Stakes get higher, culminating in the climax where characters are forced to confront these problems head first. And then the characters ultimately arrive at a resolution, though not always happy. This marks the completion of a character's journey and the embarking on a new one. And in most cases, as illustrated in this diagram from the book Playwriting Seminars 2.0, Act 1 is typically longer than Act 2. Of course, my explanation of how the structure applies is only applicable to stories that are linear, as Frozen is. Okay, now back to Let It Go as the Act 1 finale in both film and musical. Taking place roughly 30 minutes into the hour and 45-minute runtime of the movie, it makes sense as the explosive closing to the setup. At this point, we have been introduced to the full cast of characters and each of their functions in the story. However, none of the actual action of the plot starts till Act 2. Not much can happen till Elsa runs away and the winter begins. So what this means for the stage adaptation is that this first 30 minutes of groundwork leading up to the film's most popular song has to be stretched into half, if not more than half, of the total stage time, while everything I've described in Act 2 and 3 has to be condensed into the remaining half. What this results in is a seemingly disproportionate distribution of significant events between the 2 acts. Of course, I may be wrong in my assessment, seeing as I have never watched Frozen on stage. But again, since the core of the musical lies in its music, I firmly believe that all numbers should perform the dramatic function of reflecting a character's headspace as well as charting their development. So let's refer back to the cast recording real quick. Songs in Act 1 seem to have more luxury of time, and we get a lot more songs that set up character wants and motivations, which is great. I'm not really criticizing this. 2.5 songs are dedicated to Anna and Elsa's childhood. Hans not only gets a song, but also a reprise of that song, Elsa gets a new song, and Anna gets not just the duet with Hans, but also with Christoph, which is really cute. Again, I don't have a problem with this. I think that the exploration of these characters' driving force, relationships, and hardships is done really well through these new songs. But the problem starts becoming apparent when we get to Act 2. The pace seems to pick up and the narrative gaps between songs get larger, which I assume is because it's played out through dialogue on stage. Not only that, Act 2 brings us colder by the minute. In this number, we pick up from when Hans charges Elsa with treason and takes us through Anna and Christoph looking for each other, Elsa escaping with Hans in pursuit, Hans convincing Elsa that she's the cause of Anna's death, Anna finding Christoph but deciding to save Elsa from the sword instead, and ends with Anna's heart freezing over, all in the span of 4 minutes. Now, there may be stretches of dialogue in between that aren't present in the recording, but even so, they breezed through the climax of the whole plot in pretty much the duration of For the First Time in Forever. And my problem isn't with the duration of the song. I believe that stories can be skillfully crafted regardless of how much time it's given. But this climax feels so focused on simply narrating the happenings of the story, which feels odd considering not just the character-centric nature of musicals, but the character-centric nature of Frozen, the musical, thus far. We can see that most of the new songs they've added serve the purpose of delving deeper into their characters, and in Act 2 we get Monster and True Love directly before this, which so effectively deconstructs the internal struggles Anna and Elsa were facing. In Monster, we see Elsa, who has essentially been running away from her problems, finally come to terms with the fact that she is not helpless, and does have the power to stop what she started. That what she's scared of being, what everyone thinks of her, a monster, is not what she has to be. She actively chooses not to be, and stops running. And in True Love, Anna, in the face of death, realizes that her childhood yearning to be loved put her in a position to be used, betrayed, and ultimately left for dead by the very person she believed she was looking for. Despite all this, it is revealed that she still believes in the idea of true love. We see strength in her character, and though Anna is sometimes brushed off as naive, we now see that it's because love fuels her every action. These two songs perfectly set up the climax, and have the potential to add so much depth to it. Elsa's act of submission is that much more impactful because it immediately follows her finally finding the conviction to fight. Hans's revelation devastates her and completely dispels her newfound belief that she is not a villain. How could she not be when she has caused her sister's death? We see Anna, who has long conflated the idea of true love with romantic love, forgo it with barely a second thought despite having searched her entire life for it. Her love for Elsa is selfless, running deeper than anything romantic, and that's ultimately what makes it true. And that's the core message of the film visualized in this single moment. The climax holds so much more significance than the actions the characters take, so to reduce it to just that feels antithetical to what the musical has been trying to do, which is to delve deeper and explore the whys instead of just the whats. So it feels off when we hear just the ensemble sing narrate what's happening on stage, following two extremely strong character-centric songs, dissecting Anna and Elsa's deepest fears and their refusal to give in to them. This is supposed to be the culmination of our protagonist's storylines, the peak of their emotional distress and strength, yet the number feels devoid of any further insight to the characters other than Elsa singing like 4 short lines about how she has unleashed the monster. And I just can't help but think this is a ripple effect of, in addition to other creative choices, putting Let It Go in the middle of the musical. If you're developing characters and relationships in the first act just to pay it off so weakly in the second, the addition of new songs in the first half start feeling like tools to bide the time till the most commercially successful song of the film, instead of opportunities to deepen our investment in where the plot eventually takes us. Just because the audience is already familiar with the story doesn't make the ample exploration of all significant plot points any less crucial. If they had distributed the story more equally, the climax could have been given its due time to fully explore each character's struggles in their most vulnerable state, unpack the dozens of tiny decisions they make in the short 4 minutes, and dig deeper into them than the movie could. This is the point of the story where everything should come together, and I think it's a real pity that this is the part of the narrative that bore the brunt of the repercussions caused by their earlier decisions. and unfortunately, it resulted in a lackluster payoff to what could have been a great setup. Though 5 years is a substantial amount of time, I think it's safe to say that Frozen the musical would have benefited from just a tad more time in development. Maybe a little more distance from the height of the film's success could have allowed them to make creative choices that benefited the story rather than just doing what they thought would have best appealed to pre-existing fans. I understand that the expectation to live up to the hype of the title can be extremely daunting, so going the safe route probably seemed like the least offensive option. Even so, I think they could have better explored and better utilized the medium of musical theatre and played to its strengths rather than simply attempting to shove the story into a different shaped mold, adding some new songs and just hoping it'll work out. But at the end of the day, the fact that they will no longer be there when Broadway reopens can't be changed. So I guess it's just time to let it go.